I pin upon the map the most chilling and terrifying stories I have ever heard. A poor mechanic at a junkyard was shocked when he heard the voice of a little girl coming from a broken radio, blaming him for her death. Share in the comments the horror legends from your city, and I will transform them into haunting and grim stories, utilizing all my writing prowess and talent. Under my hands, I felt the cold, damp ground. Gravel pressed into my cheek, a sharp pain forcing me to clench my teeth for a moment. I lay motionless, trying to catch my breath. The moment was strikingly simple, yet inexplicably terrifying. I cry on the ground, feeling my own helplessness. Yet as I stood up, I saw her. She stood nearby, motionless and silent. A little girl with a ball in her hand. But now her clothes were dirty, torn, as if she'd been wandering here for weeks. I stopped, feeling my heart start to pound in my chest. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at me with dark eyes. I didn't know how it happened, but I felt something was off about her. Her gaze. It was too empty, too cold. The girl took a step forward, and I froze. But what happened next broke me. In an instant, her hands, which moments earlier had been clean, were suddenly scratched and covered in a thick crimson liquid. Her face was scratched, one eye turning white and lifeless as if blind. She stood before me, changed, like a living nightmare, her face twisted with rage. Her frightened expression morphed into one filled with hate. She dropped the ball to the ground and stepped closer to me. "You killed me," she screamed. The girl's scream pierced the night like a sharp knife, cutting through the darkness like old seat upholstery. I recoiled in fear, the ground slamming against my hands. My breathing turned erratic. My body froze with terror, and only one thought echoed in my mind. How did it come to this? It started a few days ago. The autumn sun shone directly into my eyes, unnaturally bright and blinding. Standing at the entrance to the scrapyard, I squinted, shielding my eyes with my hand to make out the yard in front of me. It was too bright for the evening. Such light felt out of place here, where dust, rust, and metallic grime usually ruled. I scanned the scrapyard. It seemed as if everything was just as I had left it. Even the car we were dismantling that day still stood there, stuck mid-disassembly, as if waiting for me to continue. Suddenly, a sharp pain gripped my head. I pressed my fingers to my temples, wondering if it was from the trauma or just exhaustion. With no other choice, I sighed and moved on, walking between rows of broken-down cars, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. Everything seemed familiar, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I decided to start with that car. It had been there, like a silent witness, after that incident. My brother and I were dismantling it together, and even then, I had a sense we shouldn't have taken on that job. I was exhausted, so tired that I could barely stand, but I chose not to postpone it. That decision played a cruel joke on me. Now, approaching it, I recalled that day in vivid detail. A bleak gray evening where time seemed to stretch, as if passing through thick fog. We worked in silence, unscrewing bolts, removing heavy metal parts. And then, suddenly, a sharp snap. The cable holding the engine's weight snapped. I didn't even have time to react. In an instant, I felt a searing, tearing pain in my head. The cable struck me so hard I nearly fell. Blood quickly poured over my face, blurring my vision. I remember my brother shouting something, dropping tools, but I couldn't make out the words. Only the muffled thudding of my heart and the sensation of blood dripping onto the ground. Standing before that car now, I felt a familiar ache in the area of my scar. But it wasn't just that. Next to the car where I had fallen that day, I noticed a dark stain on the ground. Back then it was crimson, fresh, bright. Now it was almost black, dried, like melted wax left after a candle burned out. The night approached, and the shadows at the scrapyard grew longer and denser. I finished my inspection, but the feeling that something had changed didn't leave me. My head continued to throb, and with every step, the pain seemed to increase, as if an iron band were tightening around my head. I entered the old shed that served as our base during night shifts. It was always quiet and dark here, but comforting. A simple table, a few chairs, a dusty old lamp, and a small couch that doubled as a bed. I tossed my jacket over a chair and sat, holding my head. My gaze fell on a small bottle of painkillers prescribed by the doctor. I hadn't planned to take them today, thinking I could manage, but the headache was driving me mad. Swallowing 2 pills, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. My muscles slowly relaxed, my breathing steadied. It felt as though the pain was receding, and my head began to feel lighter. I decided to rest a bit, knowing full well it was dangerous to fall asleep during a shift. Suddenly, a strange sound broke the silence. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a distant, unclear noise like something cutting through the ether, like an old radio barely catching a station, crackling and clicking. I opened my eyes and started listening. The sound was barely noticeable, but it was there. It seemed to come from outside the shed, like hissing, similar to radio static. I frowned, listening more intently. Could someone have left a radio on? But we hadn't used any radio equipment for ages. Moreover, this noise was too odd, as if it came from emptiness itself. It grew louder and then faded, but it remained at the edge of hearing. I rose from the chair, feeling the headache return, accompanied by a heavy, sticky sense of unease. Perhaps the pills hadn't worked yet, but everything I was hearing made my heart race. I approached the window and looked outside. The scrapyard lay under the blanket of twilight, night covering it like a shroud. But the sound didn't stop. It came from somewhere deep within the metal heaps, filling the night air with an indefinable threat. It's probably just exhaustion, I thought, though I felt a faint uncertainty even in my mind. I stepped outside, where a thick fog began to creep in. The sky was overcast, and only the moon occasionally peeked through the clouds. I shone my flashlight over the yard, spotting an old car standing apart. As if forgotten, its cabin was engulfed in darkness, but the sound was coming from there. I approached, the flashlight's beam catching the dented hood. The car was in terrible shape, as if it had recently been in a severe accident, though I could have sworn it hadn't been here just days before. The noise grew louder. I bent down and looked inside. Among the wreckage, a radio was on, but the engine wasn't running, and the keys were missing from the ignition. I listened as voices whispered something unintelligible in a language I didn't know, yet it felt strangely familiar, as if I'd heard it before. The creeping anxiety burrowed under my skin. That whisper, though quiet, became unbearable with each second. Suddenly, a sharp metallic bang sounded nearby. It was so loud that I jumped back, barely holding onto my flashlight. The radio went silent as abruptly as it had started. Silence became deafening. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and my heart pounded as if I'd just escaped the clutches of something unimaginable. I stood there, unable to move, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But my mind refused to accept it. I began convincing myself it was just trauma, hallucinations from pain and exhaustion. No cars talk, let alone react to me. I put away the flashlight and hurried back to the shed. The chill receded, but the anxiety still gnawed at me from within. Even here, in the safety of the shed, I couldn't shake the thoughts of what had just occurred. The whisper, the static, the bang on the metal, all these pieces intertwined, forming a grotesque tangle of fear and doubt. I tried closing my eyes, but as soon as I did, flashes of car crashes, shattered vehicles, and panicked voices filled my vision. What was it? Hallucinations? Or something far worse? The next evening I returned to work. I could feel the wave of anxiety rising in my chest, but I tried convincing myself it was just a consequence of fatigue and trauma. The events of the previous night had left their mark, but I still hoped that what had happened was merely the product of my tired mind. As I stepped onto the scrapyard, a strange feeling of emptiness enveloped me. No foreign sounds, no voices, no metallic clatter. Everything was unusually quiet, and at first, this even calmed me. I slowly checked every corner, inspected all the cars, but saw nothing suspicious. A sense of relief washed over me. It seemed that what I experienced the night before was just an illusion. The feeling of calm gradually returned, and I thought I could endure the shift peacefully, perhaps even rest. But just as I allowed myself to drift into thoughts, ready to let my eyes close for a moment, everything changed. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by a whisper, quiet, almost inaudible, but it was so close that it felt like someone was speaking right into my ear. I shot up, heart racing from sudden fear. I listened intently, trying to discern if it was merely the echo of a dream, but the whisper repeated, louder this time. And then I heard footsteps outside the window. This had happened before. I had caught teenagers sneaking in at night or chased off raccoons rummaging through the trash. So, grabbing a baseball bat and flashlight, I resolutely stepped outside, determined to chase away any intruders. The gravel crunched underfoot as I took a few steps into the darkness. The steps outside the window began to retreat, and I quickly moved in their direction. The flashlight's beam cut through the fog, illuminating rows of cars and the darkened ground. It seemed like someone was moving away in the shadows, trying to avoid my gaze. I could hear their steps, clear at first, then fading, as if they were running from me. The wind picked up a few leaves, playing with them in front of me. My heart pounded with adrenaline, and although a feeling of anxiety simmered inside me, anger overpowered fear. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped abruptly behind a row of cars. The silence that followed was unsettling, but I pressed on, straining to see through the darkness between the vehicles. Then, I heard it again, the familiar hissing that shattered the silence of the previous night. It sounded like a cold wind mixed with metallic echoes, like something slipping just beneath the surface of reality. My frustration grew. Someone was playing games with me, testing my nerves. I tightened my grip on the bat and slowly walked toward the sound. The hissing grew louder, sharper. Then, a voice, barely perceptible, weak, as if from far away. It drifted through the fog, disrupting the rhythm of my heartbeat. Then another voice, closer, clearer, thin, like whispers blurred in the air, followed by a moment of laughter. Light, a bit raspy. It felt so out of place in this grim place that a chill ran down my spine. I hurried toward the sound, irritation flaring inside me like fire. The voices grew louder, but as I approached, there was no one to be found. I stopped, trying to catch my bearings, listening. The same voices, now very close. I aimed the flashlight at one of the damaged cars I had inspected earlier. Something inside me turned cold. when I realized where the sound was coming from. Inside the car. My legs went numb, and a cold wind ran down my spine as if icy fingers clutched my back. I forced myself to step closer. The car's smashed front, its twisted metal exposing its innards, was beyond recognition. Half of the front was simply missing. It was hard to imagine anything alive could remain inside, let alone voices having a casual conversation. But I could hear it distinctly, soft chatter, mixed with laughter, as if those inside were blissfully unaware of their predicament. The voices didn't stop. I stepped right up to the car, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light picked out the shredded seats, shards of glass, rusted wires dangling from the dashboard. Inside, nothing. The cabin was empty, but the voices, they continued. Peering into the car, I finally understood. The voices were coming from the radio. The air inside the car felt thicker, the fog wrapping around everything like a heavy blanket. My mind spun. I wasn't sure if I should get in, but I couldn't just leave it like this, not without turning off that cursed radio. Gathering my strength, muttering every curse I could think of, I opened the door and sat down in the seat. The car felt colder than I expected, as if a deep winter frost had settled inside, despite the autumn wind outside. My hand shook as I reached for the radio. A sudden laugh made me flinch and curse under my breath. For a moment, the voices fell silent, as if I'd startled them. And just as I smirked at the thought, a man's voice echoed from the radio, repeating my curse. I barely stopped myself from crying out. The voice continued, but now I heard not only him, but a quiet female voice asking something. It was so wrong that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I sat in the broken car at the scrapyard, and from the old radio came a live conversation, as if these people were sitting right next to me, talking as if nothing was unusual. The man spoke again, his voice muffled, as if not directed at me, but at someone nearby. A few words whispered, followed by a quick rustling, and then another voice, the woman's, tense and uneven. "Did you hear that? It seems like someone is speaking." My heart froze, and my blood turned to ice. They could hear me? That was impossible. I'd only whispered something under my breath, but now they responded. So, gathering my thoughts and shaking, I dared to speak again. This time the man, hearing my weak voice, suddenly raised his tone, his nervousness now resonating with fear. "Who is this? Damn it! Where are you?" His words cut through the silence, embedding in my mind. Their tension seemed to reach me through the radio waves, amplifying the panic in the room on the other side of the frequency. All my attempts to respond were drowned out by the woman's cries, who seemed ready to scream, "Turn it off, I beg you. This isn't possible. He can't hear us." Her voice cracked, full of terror, as if she was trying to flee from something that had already become a nightmare. But the man wasn't giving up. He started shouting, his words growing louder, piercing the desperate silence of the radio waves. "Can you hear me? Answer. Is this some kind of twisted game?" The echo of his words seemed to pierce me through. I was paralyzed. It felt as if the world had stopped. Their fear wrapped around me like an iron grip. The air tensed as if on the verge of breaking, each second of connection binding us into an unseen trap of endless horror. And then, something terrible happened. A scream, the sound of tires screeching as they gripped the road, followed by a sudden sharp impact, the screech of metal ripping through the air, and the woman's scream, which stopped as abruptly as it had started. The voices vanished, leaving behind a dead silence that filled the radio. I sat frozen, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. The seat beneath me suddenly felt alien, cold, as if it too was part of this horrifying scene. My mind refused to accept what had just happened, but I knew with terrifying certainty. I had just heard 2 people die. The radio fell silent. The silence was so oppressive, it felt as if the entire world had come to a standstill along with me. Returning to my shed at the scrapyard, I felt an overwhelming exhaustion, as if the world was crumbling on my shoulders. But even here, behind closed doors and in the dim light, I didn't feel safe. I lay down on the old, creaking couch, wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to push away thoughts of what had happened. But every sound made me jump. The patter of rain on the roof, the gusts of wind outside. Everything seemed suspicious, as if something invisible was crawling nearby, hidden in the dark. Sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the same images flashed before me. The voices from the radio, the terrible sound of the crash, the girl's scream. I tried to pull away from these visions, but they wouldn't let go. Finally, when sleep did come, it wasn't restful, but a trap. I dreamed I was sitting behind the wheel of an old car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The empty road ahead stretched into infinity, calling me into the darkness. The headlights carved out a narrow strip of asphalt from the night, twisting as if it were alive. The further I drove, the more it felt like the road was pulling me into something dark and incomprehensible. A heavy weight pressed down on my chest. My heart began to race. Cold sweat trickled down my forehead and my thoughts tangled into a mess. Why was I driving? Where was I going and why? I didn't know, but I felt I had to make it to the end of this road. It was as if something terrible would happen if I didn't hurry. Suddenly, broken sounds began to emerge from the darkness. At first, they were quiet whispers, as if far away. But with every meter, every second, the sounds grew clearer. And I realized they were voices. They came from everywhere, from the walls of darkness, from the car's metal, from beneath the wheels, even from inside me. They called to me, pulled me into their eerie current, cutting through the night with disjointed cries and desperate shouts. I nervously started dialing on my phone, taking one hand off the wheel. My fingers trembled. My gaze darted between the screen and the road ahead. I sped up, pushing the car faster, as if my life depended on it. I needed someone to answer, a sign that I wasn't alone in this darkness. But no one picked up. Only long, empty rings, like a silent echo, pointing to the void. Amidst the faint buzz of the ringtone, I suddenly saw bright headlights. They appeared out of nowhere, like 2 massive orbs directed straight at me. Time slowed down, and the voices became frenzied. Their panic peaked, blending with a long, blaring horn that hit me like a scream. I saw the road before me dim, disappearing under the weight of that light. And then, impact. A dull, terrifying crash that filled everything. I felt myself being thrown back as the world went black in an instant. I jolted awake on the couch, gasping for air, feeling cold sweat soaking my body. Everything around me trembled. My heart pounded wildly. I sat in the dark, trying to calm down, but that feeling, that what had happened was more real than I wanted to admit, wouldn't let go. I listened for every rustle, every sound, trying to discern where the nightmare ended and my new, terrifying reality began. Each minute until dawn stretched endlessly. With the first light of day, I called my brother. I needed someone to be with me, just to convince myself that I hadn't lost my mind. When he arrived, I immediately took him to that car. Each step echoed dully in my head, the air heavy with the scent of metal and old oil. The car stood in the same spot where I had left it that night, and again, the noise, that familiar, persistent noise like a distant radio wave mixed with whispers. I tried to explain to my brother that it wasn't just noise, it was something more. He looked at me with concern, silently listening. It seemed difficult for him to say anything. After a few moments, he stepped closer to the car, bent his head to listen, but showed no signs of alarm. It was as if he heard nothing. But I did. That sound was woven into every step, every breath, drumming in my head, refusing to let me focus. He began examining the car, then decided to open the door and look inside. At that moment, panic washed over me. I rushed to him, grabbed his arm, pulling him back, almost shouting. He froze, startled and clearly frightened, his eyes full of disbelief and worry. I realized that to him, all of this looked like madness. He heard nothing, saw nothing, and of course didn't believe me. He chalked it all up to my recent trauma and stress. I pretended to agree, as I had no choice. All I could do was go home. The following night, everything repeated itself. Any hope that it would stop vanished as soon as I stepped onto the scrapyard. The whispering mixed with the radio noise seemed to beckon, scaring me yet forcing me to move toward that eerie call. And the closer I got, the harder it became to breathe, as if I were suffocating. And there I stood in front of the car, breathing heavily through the sleeve pressed to my face. But even so, the acrid smoke seeped through the fabric, causing spasms in my throat. The headlights flickered unevenly, growing weaker with each flash, as if the battery was moments from dying. The light carved out patches of metal, debris, and scattered parts around me. The air felt heavy, saturated. Cold seeped through my jacket, though the night was far from freezing. Everything was suspended in silence, too unnatural for the scrapyard. No rustling, no metallic sounds that should have occasionally rolled underfoot. I stepped closer to the car, peering into the shadows it cast on the twisted wrecks nearby. Each step I took was too quiet for the wet dirt beneath my feet. The sense that someone was watching me intensified. The engine continued its quiet rumble, but the sound seemed excessively loud for such a weak motor. I noticed how the reflection of my movements flickered on the car's hood in the headlight's glow, but it looked distorted. I crouched down to see my face, but at that moment, the headlights abruptly went out, plunging me into complete darkness. In the dim cabin, the radio's ghostly green light glowed, its screen flickering like an old lantern on the verge of dying. I sat in the driver's seat, feeling the rough, torn fabric scratch my back. The car reeked of stale smoke and gasoline, making me feel nauseous. Carefully, I reached for the radio dial and slowly turned it, hoping to adjust to the right frequency. My fingers trembled as they barely touched the tuning knob. I carefully rotated it, and the static gradually subsided. Strange sounds replaced it. Snippets of conversations, shouts, the noise of passing cars, old songs that seemed long gone from the airwaves. The melody faded. Then voices emerged, high-pitched, almost falsettos, singing along with the song. It sounded so strange that my palms began to sweat. My eyes started to close. The sudden fatigue crept in slowly, but inexorably. I sat in that forgotten car, feeling sleep pull me under. My eyelids grew heavy, as if an unseen force was dragging them down. I closed my eyes, And in that moment, everything changed. I was no longer sitting in a wrecked car at the scrapyard. Before me stretched an endless highway, lit by bright headlights. The cool night wind whipped against my face through the open windows, each gust palpable. Everything felt familiar. The same highway, the same feeling. But something was wrong. People laughed next to me. Their voices blended with the sounds of the night and the radio. Faces, blurred, like seen through fogged glass. They sang a familiar song, and I began to hum along, not even knowing why. Tension ran down my spine as I looked at the driver. A young woman behind the wheel, her red lipstick glistening under the dashboard light. Her eyes were on the road but vacant, as if she couldn't see where she was going. My heart pounded faster. I tried to say something, to warn her, but the words caught in my throat, stuck like a lump I couldn't swallow. My voice dissolved in the noise of the highway. No one reacted. No one even glanced my way, as if I were a ghost among them. Suddenly, the car began to swerve. The driver seemed to lose control, and the vehicle skidded. Panic gripped me as I quickly fastened the seatbelt, my heart racing wildly. The wheels slipped across the road, and the car hit something heavy, a shadow or dark object I hadn't seen. Everything happened so fast. The car lost control and flipped. I felt my body tighten, as if trapped in a vice. An impact. The sound of glass and metal shattering. Pain that shot through my entire body, as if it were being torn apart. My skull felt like it was being crushed in a vice. I tried to open my eyes but saw only darkness. And then I woke up. The first thing I felt was the same searing pain, as if my body had really been broken, even though I was still sitting in the car at the scrapyard. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounded in my chest. Tremors racked me, like after a hard blow. I instinctively touched my head. The pain didn't subside, nor did the memory of that crash, which seemed like just a dream. The radio hummed quietly, and silence enveloped everything. I sat drenched in cold sweat, trying to pull myself together. My breathing finally evened out, although my heart still pounded, echoing deep in my chest. I cautiously opened the car door and stepped out. Instantly, a sharp, searing pain shot through my chest, so intense it nearly bent me in half. It pierced me like a knife. I froze for a moment, gasping for air, trying to understand where the pain came from. But ignoring it, I mustered the strength to head home. When I finally reached home, relief washed over me at having left the scrapyard behind. But the chest pain didn't let go, pressing down like an iron band. I tried to shake off the exhaustion with a hot shower, but when I looked at myself in the mirror, it was as if lightning struck me. Horrible bruises stretched across my chest and stomach. They looked as though I'd been squeezed by seatbelts, deep and dark, like those left by survivors of car crashes. But how was that possible? I hadn't been in an accident. Without delay, I rushed through my house, feeling my heart pound desperately near my throat, my mind scrambling for any logical explanation for what was happening. My hands shook as I picked up the phone, trying to dial my brother's number. Words stuck in my throat. I could barely string together anything coherent. Finally, hearing his voice on the other end, I tried to explain but stuttered, tripped over my words, getting lost in my own phrases. He only sighed, trying to calm me with a brief, "Hang tight, I'll be there soon." I slumped to the floor, leaning against the wall, pressing the phone to my chest. When he arrived, I gathered my strength and took him to the car, determined to prove my story. But instead of the car, We found only a rusted frame, twisted and lifeless, with the remnants of its wheels deeply embedded in the ground. I tried to show that just an hour ago, the car had been real, but the sight of the wrecked vehicle spoke for itself. It would never run again. I tried to make him see what was happening, but it was futile. His face hardened, and suddenly he burst out in anger. "Are you out of your mind? I told you to rest, take time off, and you're scaring me with your stories and the way you look. Just look at yourself." His gaze was full of disappointment and frustration, and it was clear that nothing I said would convince him. I tried to explain, to prove that this wasn't just my imagination, that I was hearing things, seeing the scars and bruises as if from an accident that never happened. But he waved it off, attributing it all to my exhaustion and trauma. His words were cold and merciless, like ice, but they held no doubt. I felt all the events of the past nights, the mysterious sounds and whispers, the horrifying images and helpless fear, all blending into a knot of bitterness that began to choke me from the inside. I realized he was right. I needed to leave, and I gave in, agreeing to leave work and finally return home, to the darkness and loneliness that now seemed even more terrifying. On my way home, I felt an overwhelming emptiness. My mind replayed the obsessive images of what I had seen the day before. Was any of it real? Or was it all just the invention of an exhausted mind, hallucinations spawned by pain and isolation? Perhaps I had fallen and forgotten, and all these bruises were just the result of an unfortunate accident. I decided not to wait and went to the hospital at first light. Muted sounds echoed through the room. The rustling of medical gowns, the quiet shuffling of paper, and somewhere in the background, the steady hum of medical equipment, which resonated soothingly in the silence. The cold light streamed through the office windows, casting a pale tint that emphasized the sterile and unwelcoming atmosphere of the room. The very air here smelled of cleanliness and detachment. I sat on the examination table, trying to suppress the tremor in my hands, as Dr. Navajo carefully examined the marks on my skin. The bruises spread across my chest and stomach like deep belt marks, pressed into my skin as dark bruises that showed even through thin clothing. With each movement of the doctor, vivid fragments of my dreams came to mind, where a hand seemed to squeeze me, crushing like an iron band, leaving those marks, as if from a car accident. Just the memory of it tightened my chest. Dr. Navajo occasionally glanced at me as if trying to read the story behind the bruises, before turning back to his thoughts, finally casting a brief but puzzled look. Dr. Navajo stared out the window thoughtfully, his gaze drifting somewhere far away, as if he was lost in his own memories. The room became eerie, and even the air seemed to thicken. Suddenly he spoke, his voice low and almost whisper-like, penetrating to the core, as if through his voice, shadows beyond time were speaking to me. He began to tell an old tale that his ancestors used to share by the campfire, about a great conflict between the native tribes and the settlers. But his serious look suggested this was more than just a tale. He spoke reluctantly, as if afraid to reveal an ancient secret. The legend came alive in his words. Once, this land belonged to his ancestors, the native tribes who protected it like a sacred place. But then came the outsiders. They forged a fragile peace with the tribe, a pact that would last as long as it served both sides. But something terrible happened one day. A settler's wagon, loaded with goods, veered off the road, striking down two small children, the chief's sons. The grief and rage of the chief were boundless, having lost what was most precious to him, and it was then that he cursed the land and the invaders upon it. His words left my mouth dry, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from his dark gaze. Navajos spoke of the tribe's belief that their souls remained here forever, and that every drop of blood spilled on this land awakened the wrath of their ancestors, seeking justice for the desecrated past. The first victims were those who dared to challenge this land. Wagons shattered to pieces, wheels broke, and anyone trying to tame this land by force was doomed. Since then, centuries seem to have passed, replacing wagons with cars, but the curse remained. Activated by blood, it awaited to draw another trespasser into the world of shadows. I sat there as if spellbound, feeling cold seep into my bones. Suddenly, the terrible realization dawned on me. I remembered the blood I had spilled on the scrapyard, this forgotten place that might once have been a native settlement. I shuddered as if struck. Could this be the reason behind everything I'd seen? When my fingers touched the bruises on my chest, my heart clenched unbearably, and memories of the voices coming from the radio and the visions that drove me to the brink filled my mind. I realized that the blood I had carelessly spilled on this land had called out to the spirits, who were now demanding their due, and I might be next in line. Each step felt heavy, as if my legs dragged an invisible weight. Unwillingly, my thoughts kept returning to the doctor's story, and with each moment, it resounded more clearly in my mind. Something in his voice struck a chord so deep that I could no longer convince myself it was just a story. It felt as though the curse breathed down my neck, invisible but relentless. Resolving to confront it, I decided to get to the bottom of this once and for all, to prove to myself that it was just foolishness driving me insane. I drove out of the hospital and directed my car toward the scrapyard, planning to meet my brother and find some answers. But as I approached the empty stretch of road, I noticed a car parked in the middle of the lane. Its silhouette looked strange, eerily familiar, but it didn't fit the scene. A vintage police car that seemed dragged out of the past. The headlights shone dimly, and the hood was covered in a layer of dust that had settled over the years. I knew all the officers in this town. They often visited the scrapyard, but this car and this officer, I had never seen them before. I stopped, my heart suddenly fluttering with a subtle premonition of danger. The officer approached me unhurriedly, as if contemplating each step. His uniform was worn and frayed, a relic of past times, and his face bore a look of cold indifference. When he reached my car door, I noticed his fingers frozen near his holster. He didn't greet me, just gestured silently for me to step out of the vehicle. It was a regular situation, but with each second, fear grew stronger inside me. I remembered seeing that kind of uniform only in old photos. Those officers had long been replaced by new ones, with modern gear and clean cars. But this officer looked as if he'd stepped right out of those pictures. He examined me closely, then directed his steely gaze toward the trunk. Obediently, I opened it, trying to keep my composure. But an absurd thought already spun in my head. Could this be my brother's doing to scare me? Knowing my tendency to sometimes overthink, he might have arranged for someone to set up a little test. I nearly laughed at the idea, looking at the unfamiliar officer as if he were part of some odd performance. The officer turned to me, his gaze sharpened, almost angry. Maybe he thought I was under the influence of something because he suddenly reached into his holster and pointed his gun at me. My heart stopped beating. Cold sweat ran down my back. His hand was steady, his eyes merciless. As the unfamiliar officer slowly raised his gun, it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to that single moment. The cold steel of the weapon aimed at me glistened in the dim light of the street lamps, barely piercing through the darkness. Everything around seemed to freeze. Even the wind halted, and the silence became thick, like the night. My back pressed against the car hood, and I desperately searched the empty road for any sign of life. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. In slow motion, like a terrible dream, I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Desperately trying to calm him, I raised my hands, attempting to explain that I had done nothing wrong, but his expression remained unchanged, and his finger only clenched tighter on the cold metallic trigger. And then, out of nowhere, an ear-splitting sound pierced the silence, a car horn blaring. Before I could even comprehend what was happening, a massive truck seemed to appear out of nowhere, its headlights blinding me for a moment. The officer, looking stunned, turned to face it, but it was too late. In the next instant, the enormous metal beast crashed into him. I instinctively gasped and shielded my eyes from the inevitable sight. For a brief moment, I stood paralyzed by fear, my eyes shut tight. But when silence returned, I slowly opened them. The road before me was empty and silent, as if the scene I had just witnessed was nothing but a grotesque illusion. I stood there alone on the dark road, trying to process what had happened. But terror crept into my consciousness. It had all been real. Darkness crept over the town like a heavy curtain as I reached the scrapyard, feeling the remnants of confidence dissolve under the weight of what had just occurred. Around me was an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the distant cry of a night bird, as if mocking me. It seemed as though the air itself carried a heavy, ominous scent, a mix of dried blood, oil, and metallic dust. In this eerie atmosphere, even my breathing sounded too loud, as if each inhale squeezed my ribs tighter. Cold wind rustled through the mountains of car metal, making the rusty remnants creak and groan, as if they were uttering their final sounds before vanishing into the darkness. I felt that this place lived a sinister life of its own, where the memories of accidents, fear, and pain lingered, leaving a trace as if ghosts of the past were trapped here forever. I felt eyes on me, like small, frightened prints clinging to me from among the broken cars, caught in the curves of metal and shattered glass. The empty windows of wrecked cars stared at me like hollow eyes filled with silent accusation. Every sound quickened my heartbeat. The wind rustled through narrow passages between heaps of junk, periodically reacting to any movement or noise, and I kept turning, expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. Each step I took on the scattered debris and glass felt like stepping into the unknown, where the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. After being informed that my brother wouldn't be there until nightfall, I stepped out of the old scrapyard office, trying to call him. Several rings, and the voicemail picked up. I left a brief message, attempting to sound calm, although inside something was tightening unbearably. I leaned against the cold metal of the nearest car, watching as dusk thickened, turning the place into a dark maze. Deep down, I felt a foreboding, like an unbearable chill that pierced my bones. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, and I was no longer sure how many minutes or hours had passed. It felt like time had stopped right here, among the wreckage, frozen in darkness, silently waiting for something terrible to happen. And I knew that something was drawing closer. Immersed in the thick darkness, I stood in the scrapyard, where only scattered shadows cast shapeless outlines under the faint light. All the workers had long left, leaving me alone in this cold, eerie kingdom of broken machines. My calls to my brother remained unanswered, only the dry, automated voice responding to my anxious waiting. But stubbornly I stayed, feeling the minutes drag on as tension gripped my chest tighter. For some reason I couldn't just leave. Something unknown compelled me to wait here, among the broken metal and silence. Suddenly, I heard a muffled engine noise. One of the abandoned cars nearby came to life, its headlights suddenly blazing and slashing through the darkness like lightning. The blinding beam swept over me, and I shielded my eyes, startled and confused. I cautiously approached the car, feeling fear clutch me, seeping into every cell. Inside the cabin, there was no one, no driver, no sign of life. The engine hummed softly, as if on its own, as though this car had returned from the past to remind me of something sinister. I stood at the open door, staring at the empty driver's seat, when I saw movement in the headlight's glow. Slowly, I turned my head and froze. In front of me, slightly to the side, stood a little girl dressed in autumn clothes, holding a ball in her hand. Her silhouette looked unreal, as if she had emerged from the darkness itself. Her face was expressionless, and her dark, bottomless eyes stared straight at me. I inhaled, feeling a chill penetrate to my bones. Unable to tear my gaze away, I felt my heart pounding harder. There was something eerily wrong about her. She didn't move, but didn't look like an ordinary child who might wander into such places. Her silence was more oppressive than any scream. Before I could take a step back, the girl took a hesitant step forward, and I froze in place. She approached slowly, silently, each step echoing in the night as if drum beats. My heart pounded furiously, and I began to back away, taking cautious, small steps. But, not noticing the bumper of one of the cars behind me, I tripped and fell hard to the ground. Cold gravel scraped my skin, and pain shot through my back. For a moment, I closed my eyes, trying to collect myself, pushing away the feeling that wouldn't leave me. The silence suddenly became even more oppressive, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful. I didn't dare lift my head, afraid to see her face up close. But then, suddenly, a ringtone played nearby. The sound seemed almost absurd in this tense darkness, and I reflexively glanced at the phone which had fallen out of my pocket and lay glowing brightly on the ground. Barely breathing, I looked back to where the girl had stood. She was gone. I stood there trying to process what I had seen, but my mind refused to accept it. Just moments before, she had been there, tangible and terrifying in her silent hatred. Now, no trace, no sound, no hint that it had been real. Only the cold headlights of the car still shone on the empty spot where that ghost of the past had stood. I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling, and grabbed the phone from the ground. On the screen, my brother's name and number glowed. Moments later, his voice cut through the silence, filled with worry, although there was a fair share of static and interference. He asked where I was, and upon hearing my answer, he fired off more questions, asking if I was okay and if I'd seen the girl. Through the static and fragmented words, I picked up on the deep concern in his tone. I realized that my brother believed me, even though he hadn't before. He urged me to stay put and wait, warning me not to leave the scrapyard under any circumstances. His voice became harder to hear until the line disconnected, leaving me holding a dead phone in my hands. Alone, I headed toward the small guard shed on the edge of the scrapyard. Inside, I started the kettle, made myself strong coffee, and sat heavily in the old chair. The hot drink warmed my hands, and the air filled with the mixed scents of coffee, wood, and metal. I watched the steam curl upward, dissolving into the darkness. Time seemed to stand still, waiting. My eyes darted around the room, catching every shadow and noise. The corners were silent, but outside, occasional glints from the metal flickered in the night. I decided to wait, stubbornly gripping the cup, which barely radiated warmth. With each sip, the bitter taste of the coffee grew stronger, leaving a heavy residue of anxiety. By morning, my brother still hadn't arrived. I spent the entire time on edge, not closing my eyes. My head throbbed with a dull pain, and the area around my scar felt like it was being pressed with a burning force. When the first rays of dawn crept into the dimly lit shed, I finally stood up. The anxiety had turned into an oppressive foreboding. I stepped outside into the cool air, feeling as if the silence itself was watching me. Not a sound, not a whisper. An unnatural stillness, as if the scrapyard had absorbed the radio noise that had taunted my mind and replaced it with a deafening void. I walked toward the car where I had seen the strange girl. After taking a few steps, I halted and held my breath, noticing spots on the ground. Crimson stains were visible on the gravel, and only now did I feel the throbbing pain at the sight of my scar. Apparently, I had torn the wound open the night before, and a few drops of blood had fallen onto the gray stones. Maybe that's why the girl had disappeared, because as the doctor said, everything begins and ends here. With a sense of relief and an almost carefree feeling, I rushed to find my brother. I wanted to share everything with him, to tell him about the nightmares, the absurd visions, and the curse that perhaps had now lifted. As I moved away from the scrapyard, I saw how the morning darkness was broken by flashing lights, sharp knife-like flashes of red and blue from a police car and an ambulance. My heart pounded so loudly it seemed even worse than the siren wailing in the distance ahead. The relief that had been so powerful just moments ago evaporated, giving way to fear, cold and burning. My legs felt heavy, and even my mind seemed clouded, but an inexplicable force pushed me forward. Stopping nearby, I saw it. My brother's red pickup, wrecked and twisted, stretched along the roadside like a dimmed beacon in the dark. I stepped out of my car and took a breath. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of burned metal mixed with a salty iron tang. Every step closer felt like a struggle against an unseen current that threatened to drag me down into the depths of grief and horror. Doctors from the hospital, acquaintances, seemed to deliberately avoid making eye contact with me. They approached. Their words reached me as if muffled, heavy, and slow. My brother had died. The sounds didn't register in my mind. Only one thought echoed over and over. My brother was dead. His pickup truck had supposedly been struck by a semi, yet there were no tire tracks, no debris. Nothing to confirm this. Only his wrecked vehicle on the road. The memory of that night pulsed in my head. A police officer's face twisted in anger. The sound of the truck that appeared out of nowhere, passing right through him. The despair that had settled within me grew into a nightmarish realization. It should have been me. I was the one meant to die, not him. He died in my place, a silent victim of some unknown evil. That's when the doctor's words about the curse that could be stopped by my blood came back to me, and I felt a cold grip tighten inside me. My brother and I shared the same blood, His death? Could it have been my last chance at life? That thought repeated like an unseen crime, a shadow following you even in the dark. And now, that was all I had left, an unbreakable bond with my brother, one I might never be able to sever. The police returned the pickup a few days after my brother's funeral. They left it in the yard, as if it were just another piece of metal no one needed anymore. I chose not to fix it, but I couldn't just send it off for scrap, turning it into a pile of metal that would be broken down for parts. Instead, I left it on a remote section of the junkyard, away from the other cars, as if that's where it belonged. Every night, after long rounds through the deserted rows of cars, I would return to his pickup. I'd sit in the intact passenger seat, the only part that survived in the shattered cab. I pressed the radio button and static, hums, and crackles filled the air. Usually no other sound broke through the static hiss, but over time I began to hear something else. A troubled, muffled voice. My brother's voice. Words that came through the old, broken radio shattered the silence around me. He spoke to me, just like on that last night. Stay safe. It crackled over and over. Stay at the junkyard. Those were his last words before he died, now repeated like a chant, woven into the hum of the darkness. And every night, sitting in that passenger seat, I listened to his voice, feeling the chill seep into my soul with every hiss and word. No other car in the junkyard came to life. No other radio turned on. Only his pickup, only his voice. And sitting there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was really there with me. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.